A nation stands on the edge of collapse. Food reserves are gone. The harvest has failed for the third year. Children are dying in the streets. The government has a choice. Open the borders and accept help, or close them tighter and let the people starve while protecting something far more valuable than their lives. The decision takes less than a day. Within weeks, the world will witness one of the most calculated acts of mass suffering in modern history. But here's what makes it different. This wasn't incompetence or chaos. This was a choice. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, North Korea lost more than an ally. It lost the economic lifeline that had sustained it for decades. Soviet subsidies vanished overnight. Oil shipments stopped. Food imports dried up. The entire system that had kept the country functioning simply ceased to exist. For years, North Korea had proclaimed itself a model of self-reliance, a nation that needed no one. The state called it Juche, complete independence from the outside world. But the truth was far different. Beneath the propaganda, the country had been dependent on Soviet support all along. The farms ran on Soviet fuel. The factories operated with Soviet materials. The people ate food purchased with Soviet aid. Now that support was gone. Then nature struck. In 1995, catastrophic floods swept across the country, destroying what little remained of the harvest. Rivers burst their banks, fields turned to mud, entire crops washed away. The following year brought more floods, then drought. The land itself seemed to be turning against the people. Food reserves began to empty, rations shrank, then they stopped altogether. And from Pyongyang, from the leadership that controlled every aspect of life, there was only silence. No acknowledgement of the crisis. No call for help. No explanation of what was happening or what would come next. The famine had begun. But the regime had made a choice long before the first person starved. The rations stopped arriving in the spring of 1995. Not gradually, not with warning. They simply stopped. For decades, the public distribution system had delivered rice and corn to every household. It was the foundation of survival. Now, families opened their doors to find nothing. The state that had promised to feed its people had gone silent. In the cities, people began stripping bark from trees. Elm bark could be boiled into a paste. Pine bark was tougher, but edible if you were desperate enough. Children learned to identify which plants wouldn't kill them. Grass became a meal. Weeds became precious. Mothers ground corn cobs into powder, mixing it with anything that could fill a stomach. The word food lost its meaning. Survival became about volume, not nutrition. Families burned their furniture. Chairs went first, then tables, then bed frames. Anything wooden disappeared into stoves that barely produced heat. In the countryside, entire forests were stripped bare. Hillsides turned gray and skeletal. People dug for roots in frozen ground, their hands cracking and bleeding. The landscape itself seemed to be dying. But the military bases looked different. Soldiers still stood at attention with straight backs and clear eyes. Their uniforms fit properly. Their faces were not hollow. Trucks delivered rice to barracks on schedules that never faltered. While children collapsed in schoolyards from hunger, military kitchens served full meals. The contrast was not hidden. It was visible, deliberate. The nuclear facilities at Yongbyon never went dark. Cooling systems hummed. Technicians reported for shifts. Construction continued on reactor sites. Electricity that could have powered hospitals flowed instead to weapons research. Resources that could have purchased grain from China bought centrifuges and uranium. The regime's priorities were written in the glow of those facilities against a darkening nation. State propaganda did not acknowledge the famine. It spoke of the arduous march, framing starvation as a patriotic test. Billboards showed soldiers standing firm against American aggression. Radio broadcasts praised the strength of the Korean spirit. The message was clear. Sacrifice was noble. Hunger was temporary. The military was eternal. Survival meant different things depending on where you stood in the hierarchy. In the markets that began appearing illegally, people traded family heirlooms for handfuls of corn, a wedding ring for a week of food, a watch for a bag of rice. The economy of desperation had its own rules. Those with nothing to trade began the long walk toward the Chinese border, hoping for something, anything, on the other side. Many did not make it. Bodies appeared on roadsides, then disappeared, then appeared again. The state's choice was never spoken but always visible. Every truckload of grain that rolled past starving villages toward military compounds. Every power line that fed a weapons facility while homes went cold. Every propaganda poster celebrating strength while children's bellies swelled with malnutrition. This was not neglect. This was selection. A calculation of who mattered and who did not. Most people stop at the surface of history, but you're still here. So if you want the parts they don't teach, the truths buried beneath time, consider subscribing and becoming part of those who chose to see it all. Now, let's continue. The border had always been watched, but hunger made people brave in ways fear never could. In the winter of 1997, the first trickle of refugees began crossing the frozen Tumen River into China. They came at night, weak and stumbling, some carrying children too frail to walk. What they brought with them was more dangerous to the regime than any weapon. The truth. Chinese border guards found them hiding in barns and abandoned buildings. Aid workers heard stories that seemed impossible to believe. Entire families had died in their homes, too weak to move. Children had been left at orphanages that had no food to give them. People spoke of eating tree bark, grass, anything that could be chewed and swallowed. They described neighbors who simply disappeared, and the unspoken understanding of what desperation could drive people to do. These weren't propaganda claims or political statements. These were ordinary people describing the end of their world. The testimonies spread through refugee networks and into the hands of international organizations. Each account confirmed the others. The famine wasn't a natural disaster being managed. It was a catastrophe being ignored. While people starved in the northern provinces, Pyongyang remained lit. While children died in the countryside, the military still received rations. The pattern was undeniable, and now it had witnesses. Then the satellites revealed what the regime had tried to conceal. Intelligence analysts studying nighttime images of the Korean peninsula noticed something stark. South Korea blazed with light. But the north was going dark. City by city, region by region, the lights were disappearing. Entire urban centers that once glowed on satellite photos now sat in blackness. The electrical grid wasn't failing everywhere equally. It was being deliberately shut down. Only two areas remained consistently bright: Pyongyang and the military zones. While millions lived without power, without heat, without the basic infrastructure needed to survive a brutal winter, the capital continued to function. The weapons facilities kept operating. The choice had been made visible from space. The regime was cannibalizing its own nation to keep the center alive. The defector testimonies and the satellite evidence created an undeniable picture. This wasn't a government struggling to save its people. This was a government deciding who would live and who would die. And the decision had already been made. By 1997, North Korea had crossed into a realm few nations ever reach. The famine no longer killed quietly in remote villages. It consumed entire regions with a ferocity that shattered every remaining social boundary. In the northeastern provinces, bodies lay uncollected in the streets. Children stopped crying because they no longer had the energy. The living walked past the dead without reaction, their faces hollow, their movements mechanical. Then the reports began to surface. Whispers at first, then testimonies from defectors who had seen things they could barely speak aloud. Cannibalism. Not widespread, not organized, but real. Desperate parents who had watched their children starve. Individuals driven so far beyond hunger that the unthinkable became survival. The regime denied it. Foreign observers struggled to verify it, but the accounts kept coming, each one more harrowing than the last. The children became ghosts. They called them kotjebi, wandering swallows, orphans, or abandoned by parents too weak to feed them. They roamed the countryside in packs. They slept in train stations, under bridges, in the ruins of shuttered factories. They begged, they stole, they died in the cold. Some were as young as 5. By the thousands, they drifted through a country that had no system left to catch them. The state that once promised to care for every citizen now stepped over their bodies. The death toll climbed past any number the regime would ever admit. 200,000, 500,000. Some estimates reached over 1 million. Entire families vanished. Villages emptied. The true scale would never be known because the government refused to count, refused to acknowledge, refused to ask for the help that might have saved them. And in the middle of this collapse, Kim Jong-Il made his choice clear. While his people ate bark and grass, while children died in the streets, the regime poured resources into the Yongbyon nuclear complex. In August 1998, North Korea launched the Taepodong-1 missile over Japan. The message was unmistakable. The weapons program was not delayed. It was not paused. It was accelerated. The military received fuel, electricity, food. The elite in Pyongyang lived behind walls where the famine did not exist. The rest of the country was left to survive or disappear. The regime had made its calculation. The people were expendable. The weapons were not. Survival meant the survival of power, not the survival of the nation. And so the famine raged on, not because there was no solution, but because the solution was never the priority. The silence that followed was not peace. It was exhaustion. By 1998, the dying had slowed not because the state had saved its people, but because there were fewer left to save. The survivors who remained were fundamentally changed, their bodies thinner, their eyes harder, their faith in the system irreversibly broken. The public distribution system never recovered. The ration cards that once represented the state's promise to feed its citizens became worthless scraps of paper. In its place, something the regime had never intended emerged from the desperation. The Jangmadang, the grassroots markets where women traded anything they could grow, make, or smuggle. What began as survival became infrastructure. Housewives became merchants. Farmers became smugglers. The state that had controlled every grain of rice now watched as its people fed themselves through networks it could not see and did not sanction. The regime's response was not gratitude, but alarm. The famine had revealed a dangerous truth. North Koreans could survive without the state. This could not stand. As the black market spread, so did the crackdowns. Market traders were arrested. Border guards were ordered to shoot smugglers on sight. Propaganda loudspeakers blared warnings about capitalist contamination. But the markets did not disappear. They simply moved, adapted, bribed their way into existence again and again. The government had learned its lesson, but not the one the world hoped for. It learned that a population could be starved into submission. It learned that hundreds of thousands could die while the military remained fed and loyal. It learned that the international community would express concern, send limited aid, and ultimately do nothing to threaten the regime's existence. The famine had not weakened Kim Jong-il's grip on power. It had clarified it. Loyalty was rewarded with food. Dissent was met with starvation. The system worked exactly as designed. In the years that followed, North Korea's nuclear program accelerated. The same regime that claimed it had no food for children somehow found resources for missile tests. The same government that watched its people eat bark invested in uranium enrichment. The priorities had never been unclear. The famine had simply made them undeniable. The survivors carried the scars forward. An entire generation grew up stunted, their bodies marked by malnutrition, their minds shaped by the knowledge that the state had chosen to let them starve. They did not speak of it openly. Speaking meant risk, but the memory lived in their silence, in the way they hoarded food, in the way they trusted the markets more than the ration system, in the way they understood that survival meant relying on no one but themselves. The famine ended, but North Korea never returned to what it was before. The state had revealed its true face, and the people had learned to survive in spite of it. And the world, having watched it all unfold, moved on to the next crisis, leaving behind a nation where starvation had become policy and silence had become survival.